Hi, you want to do some quilting together today? Have a little fun here. I found out with my collarbone it's a lot slower for me to quilt, but if I rest my elbow on the arm of the chair and if I don't reach too far out, I can still quilt okay. But I'm going to sit and work on this quilt and try to get something done because it's taken up my living room. I think my husband would like to be able to sit down on the couch now and then. We used to sit around the quilt. We'd bring all our little kids over and had half a dozen friends, and the kids would play under the quilt, and we'd sit and laugh and quilt all day long and tell stories about our families. So I wish I could put y'all in my pocket in my living room today, and we would just quilt together and tell stories. Can't raise kids without lots of incidents in your life, can you? And we've had some fun ones, but a couple of them I ended up writing a story for my kids on. And one of them was, we called it the Egg Day. I had a little boy that is really curious, and you gave him a toy, he generally took the toy apart to see what made it tick. He had a very curious little mind, and he liked to experience things, and that has fared him well. He's done very well in life because he's so curious and willing to learn. But he decided that he liked eggs, so I was sitting one day, getting my housework done, and I heard him laughing in the kitchen in a funny way, and I went in there. And he was sitting on the floor. The fridge was open. He had a dozen eggs on the floor, and he had broke most of the eggs, and he was just fishing through those eggs. You know how slimy they are, and he was draping them in his hair and wiping across his legs and just covering himself with this egg slime. And I about died. So I picked him up, took him and put him in the bathtub, and got him all washed up and redressed. He was about 3 years old. And then I went back to the kitchen to clean up the slime, and you know what it's like to clean up eggs. They just don't cooperate very well. Didn't have the luxury of paper towels at the time, so I'm in there and just about done getting all the eggs up and getting the floor cleaned when I heard the two of them in the bathroom, and I could hear that something was going on. I could hear water splashing, and went running in there, and his little sister was just crawling, and she was sitting on the floor by the toilet, and he was dipping wads of toilet paper in the toilet, unrolling a bunch and dipping them on her head, and he was all wet and she was all wet. And I'm talking less than a few minutes he could come up with something like this. So I put them both in the bathtub and washed them all up. And while they were playing in the bathtub, I cleaned up the mess on the floor and got him out and got him dressed and was dressing the baby, had her all wrapped up in a towel, getting her clothes back on her, had her in the bedroom, getting her dressed, and I got off a quiet house. And I couldn't hear him, and I heard this funny little laugh, and I just, oh no, what now? Went running into the kitchen, and there he was with another dozen eggs on the floor, and he was just having a ball. He just wanted to do that. I'm afraid I lost it. I paddled his little bottom and took him in and showered him off with cold water, and then bathed him and got him dressed again. And I was so sick of cleaning up eggs that day. I regret to say I lost my temper on that one. Apologized to him later in life. He was just, you never know what kids are going to do, but he was my fun one. And my husband we lived in Idaho Falls at the time, and he was digging up a garden in the backyard, and there were those great big huge night crawlers that you fish with. And my little boy was fascinated with the night crawlers. And he gathered them up in a can, and he played with them all day long. And he had mommy, daddy night crawlers and baby night crawlers, all the different sizes, and they were his worm family. And he just had a ball with those worms. And when it came bedtime, I told him he couldn't bring his worms to the house. He had to leave them outside. And he was real unhappy with me. He didn't want to leave his worm family outside. But we put him in a can and put some dirt in around him and put him out by the back door. And next morning I got up early and I was doing washing. It's back in the old days when I had wash tubs and I had an old wringer washer. And we always put the hot water in the washer and wash the whites first so they wouldn't get really bad. And then, you know, I would get the next batch going, we'd run them through the wringer and rinse them out in the sink and run them through the wringer and then take them out and hang them on the clothesline. And I had washed them and I had washed the coloreds, and the last load always to go in was the blue jeans because it wouldn't matter if the water wasn't quite as sparkly. And I was out hanging up the next load on the line when he came out of the house. He woke up and he says, "Mama, where's my worm family?" And I said, "Well, they're in the can by the porch." And he says, "No, I took them in the house last night." I said, "What?" And I said, "Where'd you put your worm family?" He says, "In my blue jean pocket." Ah, have you ever had clothes full of night crawlers? The whole washer was full of night crawlers. And they were floating. Of course, they drowned, and they were stuck to the clothes, and I had to scrub those clothes one at a time. But we opened that washer, and they were floating around, and he looked at me and went, "Mama, you murdered my worm family." I about died. I was in trouble with him because I drowned his worm family. And, oh, I have never forgot that. It's just, that was one of those crazy days that we had fun doing things with little kids. My son has a couple little boys like that. He has one that likes to dump things out. And he has had quite the experience with cooking oil all over the house and little tiny footprints through the cooking oil. And shampoo, the little boy liked to get in the carpet and make it fuzz up really good, make it foam really good. And his little boy takes after his brother. That's what kinds of crazy things your kids have your kids done. I'm sure there are things that you look back on now and you can laugh about that you didn't laugh about at the time, didn't think were so funny. But that's one of the things that we did that was kind of crazy. Time for another thread. You know what? I wish I could gather up all the time in 1 hour or whatever time it is that I spend threading needles, because I can't see as well as I used to, and sometimes I can't thread them. But I did that little churn dash on the sewing machine. I went up to my sister's last weekend. She is making beautiful quilts on her sewing machine, and she just has a little 17-year-old Bernina with a darning foot, and she does beautiful work on her machine. And I was tickled to see that. But I came home and I was doing that little churn dash on my sewing machine. I was supposed to make these circles. My circles look like a snake made them, because somehow, along with the dark hands and the snakes, my circle was squiggly. It wasn't right straight around. And I don't seem to have the same kind of control. And partly I was frustrated with that whole block because of the white on white material, and I had trouble with that and had to do a lot of picking out. And I don't enjoy doing that. And all the time I was doing that little quilt, I was thinking about this one sitting in my living room, how much I enjoy quilting. I don't know why I ever started that other one, just trying to keep up with Pat's challenge. When it came to the string bean quilt, I said, I'm not doing that, because I have got to finish this. I've got to spend all my time quilting until I get this quilt finished. And then I'm going to start one of those glacial stars and a medallion quilt. So I'm going to do a couple of other ones. That's a little more exciting to me. What kind of stories do you have you can tell about your little kids and the interesting things you did? One of the funny things we did, and it probably wasn't so funny, it was probably more dangerous when I was a kid, lived in Cody, Wyoming, and I had a friend that lived downtown, and she had a neighbor across the street. Mom and Dad let me go down and spend a couple hours with her once in a while. one night we were down there, and it's in the middle of the summer. Cody's a big boom town with tourists and cowboys there for the rodeo. And we decided to go out and sit on the lawn and wave at people, not thinking, I was maybe 13, 14 years old. Pretty naive about life. And we went out and sat on the corner on the Main Street, and we were sitting right in front of a motel. Didn't even think about it. We're just young girls. And life was a little different then. And we were waving at people as they went by, and this group of cowboys kept going by, and they kept waving at us. I can just imagine today what they must have been thinking of these little girls sitting there on the side of the road waving at them. And they started to come back. We took off running. We ran through the motel parking lot and back into the back fence and went back to my friend's house and didn't think anything more about it. We were just laughing. We just thought it was a big lark. A few days later, we were downtown. We were walking. We were going to get a ice cream cone at the soda shop. And as we did that, here comes these guys in their car, and they're trying to corner us in an alley. And we were scared. And my friend, it was a heavy-set girl, and you know what? She jumped the fence in a second. We had to go over the fence. We were scared to death. If I told my mother what we'd done, she probably would have shot us all. But that was just one of the silly things that we did that probably didn't, being too young to really think about what we were doing and what it might mean. Why our mothers get gray hair and why we get gray hair. I'm doing these feathers in a quilt, and they go every which way. And I have to be able to quilt every direction. We had a fun get-together last night. We had a Relief Society birthday party. Relief Society is the women's organization of the LDS Church, and we were having a birthday party for the Relief Society birthday. And what we did was, during the last couple of weeks, we all donated a service that people could auction off. And when we got there, they had all kinds of questions. Did you have children? How many? You got so many points for each child, and so many points for each grandchild, and points if you said your prayers today, and points if you read your scriptures, and points if you quilted, and points if you'd been to the temple in the last month. And there were about 38 questions, points if you took a shower today or curled your hair. There's just a million different questions that they came up with, about 38 of them. Got tangled up here. So anyway, last night we went in and we answered our questions, and having 42 grandchildren gave me a bit of an advantage because we got 5 points for each grandchild. And that was quite a few points for me. I had 540 in the long run. So we got into the auction. We had a lot of fun laughing and talking and auctioning off things. And there was, somebody was making sugar scrub for people, and somebody else offered to be a walking partner for 2 weeks. And there was all kinds of cookies and breads and several baby quilts and homemade jam with a friend, and just kind of fun things. And I was able to bid on a chocolate mousse cake, so this weekend somebody's going to bring me, my friend Donna Swartz is going to bring me a chocolate mousse cake. And I'm looking forward to that. She's a really good cook, and I think that will be fun. And another friend is making lemon meringue pie, so I get a lemon meringue pie. And I'll have to share those because I can't eat that much dessert, but that would be a fun way to get together to find different things that you can auction off and do for each other. I'm almost all the way around this star with the feathers. One things I do when I'm quilting, if I have a short space, maybe a quarter of an inch to go through to another line and I finished one line, I don't tie off. I slide in between the layers underneath the quilt and take my needle to the next line. It's never caused me a problem. There's not a lot of stress on the thread that way because the quilting's so close together. But that's one way that you can work with that. Here's a point where I didn't get my corners quite together like I would have liked them. We call that my humility block, the one that I made a mistake on. I'm afraid at my age I get a few more than I would like humility blocks where something doesn't quite meet up like I would like it to. The churn dash quilt was that way for me. I kept working with those tiny pieces and I kept getting that white on white material the wrong direction. I never did so much picking out in my life on anything I can think of because I would turn those the wrong direction. I got more and more frustrated with it. I didn't like the quilt at all by the time I got it done. I bound it yesterday and it's done, but I'm finding out that a small quilt like that takes just as much work as a big one almost. And I did quilt that one on the machine, and that's the one with the snake lines on it. Yeah. Wished I'd quilted it by hand, but I was too frustrated with it to do that. So, wasn't that happy with that little one. Oh, let's see. This time I'm going to break off. Gotta go backwards to myself. Back one stitch, back forward that stitch, thread in between the layers of material for a ways. Be really careful when you're doing that you don't get thread on the back side. I've done that a couple of times and turn the quilt over, and here's this inch-long stitch that I have to take out because I ran my thread through the quilt and have to put that back in again. There's another way I make knots. I lick my finger, wrap it around my finger, and roll it. That's the old-fashioned way of making knots, and sometimes I revert to that. Let's see. Let's come up here. I'm going to be going backwards to myself here. This is a little harder to do. That is not my favorite direction to quilt. Straight up this way or back that direction are the two directions that are very difficult for me, and that's what is required on these feathers. I have to kind of twist myself into a knot. Whoops, that stitch is a foot long. Very hard to control the needle this direction. Get one stitch through the seam. If my shoulder will let me, without too much problem, I'm going to marathon this quilt the next couple of weeks and finish this one rather than sewing or doing anything, except I do have 2 classes at Quilting Center in the next couple of weeks. So it depends on how many hours I can quilt before my shoulder says it's done. And my collarbone is crazy. All right. A lot of details in this quilt. But boy, is it going to be pretty when it's done. I like fussy quilting. Utah Quilt Guild had our Syracuse Guild had a trunk show yesterday. Had a quilter come that does, she has a quilting machine, and she had quite a few quilts. I thought, man, I'd have a hard time having a trunk show because the quilts I've made are in New York and Colorado and Washington and Texas, and they're scattered all over the world. all across the States anyway. I haven't kept very many at home, but she had a lot of small quilts. I tend to make these great big king-size quilts, and hers were about table size or a little bigger. She did have a couple of bigger ones, but I loved the way she put the colors together. They were really pretty. I wished I'd had my camera with me. I forgot left my phone home, so I couldn't take pictures. Beautiful patterns that she put together, but the one thing is that almost all of the quilts were quilted with the same overall pattern instead of what we call fussy quilting, where you follow the line. And I get, when you're making multiple quilts for children and stuff, that's probably the way to go. When you're making a masterpiece like this, I think quilting it all over one direction might not be the thing to do, you know, with one pattern, because even though the pattern looks pretty, the quilting gives it its personality and it stands out. And it's nice to have it fussy quilted. And I know the little gal down here at Sew and Save will do fussy quilting. It costs a little more money because it takes more time. And it takes more thread, actually. This is my third spool of thread on this quilt, and I'm only maybe a third finished with it. I may have to buy more thread before I'm done. Let's see, thread my needle again. Quilter's knot. Finish this feather up here at top. I can't get that knot to. Maybe if I hold my mouth just right, then I'll go through. There we go. It's funny, I was watching one of these videos the other day to see how it worked, and realized that as I was quilting, I was making all kinds of faces as I worked through, frowning and clenching my jaw and trying to make the stitches work right. I didn't realize that I used my face to quilt with. Thought that was funny. It affects what I do, or my quilting affects my expression. Ah! My pliers tangled up. Have to be careful about that, because if they get too tangled in them, it cuts the thread. Now I have a mess. I tried to do a bunch of quilting on this quilt the way you do it on the machine, with the little circles and different small patterns, and didn't like it. I even asked a question online about one of them. Somehow it just didn't look right. What works with the sewing machine does not work by hand, because there's space between the stitches instead of being solid. And I had done several things. I tried one shape in the white, and when I sat and looked at it, I had quilted partway across one whole side of the quilt, and I did not like that. I knew it was always going to bother me. My husband thought I was crazy, but I sat one day and I picked out all that quilting and redid it with a different line, a straighter line, and I like it a lot better. So I corrected the quilting, and you can do that if you're experimenting. This quilt was kind of decide on the pattern as I went along in one spot or another. And the center's different, the shapes in the center are totally different, so when I get in there, I'm going to need to come up with some other designs and try to match it to what I've done on the outside, so that I keep some continuity in the quilt. Let's see. this star, these big white stars are part of the problem I had. I tried several things in them. In the first one and took it out, and tried another thing and took it out. It's a good thing I didn't wear the quilt out, but I couldn't make up my mind what would look good in these stars until I brought a piece of tracing paper, a large piece of element on the quilt, and I laid it down and traced the shape of the star, and then went and sat down and looked at online and Pinterest at some of the different ideas. And what I actually ended up doing was creating a feather design. Let's see, where's my design? I'm using a couple of templates for this quilt, one I bought and the one that I made. And what I ended up with is a piece of poster board, and it's just 1/4 of the star, so I can turn it either way and place it on the star, and that's what I have all the way around here. And then I'm using this commercial template, these little shapes for a lot of the other stuff. And then a lot of straight lines, angle lines, because of the way the quilt's made. And that's looking pretty good on this quilt. So this will be pretty when it's done. Okay, if I hold my tongue just right, I think it'll go that direction. That's a hard way to quilt for me. Frequently, the thimble has all the control on the needle up and down. If I have fingers to move the fabric up and down, I can do that. I can put the thimble behind it. But you have to be careful when you're doing that it doesn't slip off. I slipped off the other day and rammed the back of the needle right into my little finger, right at the fingernail, and the upper side of my fingernail, and that hurt. And once in a while I'll slip off and cost me some blood on the quilt. I have to be careful. And I don't usually poke my fingers very often anymore. I used to. I had a friend I'm working with, and she picks, her fingers have holes in them by the time she finishes quilting. And ouch, they really hurt. Now I've got to break off and come back the other direction because I can't quilt that direction. Usually make the quilter's knot now, but once in a while I find myself unconsciously going back to the old-fashioned method where I lick my finger and roll the finger around on my needle, on my finger. Okay, it's awkward backwards quilting. Got it. Wish I could quilt as fast as Chopin plays that music. Would be nice. My little sister plays the piano like that, and I love to listen to her play. Oh, great big seam there. One thing you have to be when you're going to be a hand quilter is patient, because it takes time. And you can see how much time it takes just to do a small area like this when you're doing this much quilting. But it's pretty sweet when it's done, so it's worth the time and it's worth the effort to do it. This quilt is a little too complicated, a little too big for my quilting hoop. It would be hard to hold up the bulk of this quilt. When I was quilting in the center on the hoop, I could do the sides, but it would be hard to do this part of it. One of the things about piece quilts versus a whole cloth quilt is that they are a lot heavier. There's a lot more fabric in them, and with all the seams, the weight of the quilt's increased quite a bit. If you're first learning to hand quilt, I recommend getting a whole cloth piece and drawing a pattern on it and hand quilting that pattern and make it nice. Whoops. This time I'm going to slide between. That's a small space, and go up the other side. I've only got 2 or 3 fronds to do here for this to be finished. Anyway, my shoulder's saying it's time to take a break. So have a great day quilting. Laugh. Tell me some stories I can laugh at. Talk to you later.